What's up, everybody? Jimmy Smith giving my initial thoughts on UFC 249. Not a breakdown. I'll do that maybe next week before it comes out and all this stuff. Just my initial thoughts on the developments we're seeing about the fight and where the fight might be. This morning, what's going around is that it's at Tachi Palace, which is in Lemoore, California, which is in the San Joaquin Valley, on tribal land. Interesting choice. When the UFC said they were going out west, I thought it would be maybe a small state, Idaho, something like that would sanction it. The next, of course, the next logical choice would be tribal land, because there's a lot of it in California. The UFC, whether you believe they should be having this fight or not, is taking a massive risk on a lot of different fronts. And doing it on tribal land is taking another risk. And I'll go through them one at a time, exactly what's going on here. The first thing is they are going before everybody else. They're first. As a result, they're taking on a lot more responsibility in that, just like your mom said, it's all fun and games until someone gets hurt. This is all fun and games until somebody gets sick. The UFC is wagering extremely heavy on the fact that no one's going to get ill because of this event. If someone does, their responsibility is huge for a lot of reasons. First off, like I said, they're going before everyone. They can't fall back on, well, everybody went back to work. NFL was having shows, NHL was having shows, NBA was having shows, Major League Baseball. We are just another sports outlet that thought it was okay to go back. So we don't bear any personal responsibility for this. Them being first legally puts them in a lot of jeopardy, just because SureDog, if you didn't see it, they had an article about kind of the legal ramifications of holding an event right now. And they had a legal expert weigh in, and what he kept saying is reasonable effort to not get someone sick. Reasonable effort, reasonable conduct. In the backdrop of this environment we're in now, they can't fall back on this was reasonable conduct because no one else is doing it. If someone got ill and they got sued, their lawyer would argue, look at what all these other sports leagues weren't doing. Reasonable conduct was not having an event. That's reasonable. The last year, in my employment state, being in flux, I've been doing work for a law firm, and they do personal injury and liability lawsuits all the time. And so I've learned a lot about the subject. And one of the things is reasonable conduct is a comparison to what, if other stores didn't stack this item way up here so it fell on somebody, your conduct isn't reasonable. A lot of times reasonable conduct is compared to other people's conduct. Everybody else was doing this to make this safe. You did this. So your conduct isn't reasonable. The problem is other sports leagues aren't doing this. So the UFC is kind of on an island, literally and metaphorically, by themselves. They're taking a step no one else is taking. Therefore, their idea that this is reasonable, everybody else was doing it, goes out the window. They can't make that argument. The second thing is, holding it on tribal land, you're getting around California State Athletic Commission. You're intentionally going somewhere that has to get around the regulations of California. So if they had found a state that would sign off on this, they can say in a court of law, well, the Athletic Commission sanctioned it. They test the fighters. They make sure fighter welfare is taken care of, and that's not our problem, right? We put on the event. They check out the fighters. Well, in going around that and going to tribal land, once again, you're taking all the responsibility on yourself. If something went wrong, you can't say, well, the state of California sanctioned it, because they didn't. Can you say the tribal commission sanctioned it? Sure, but the tribal commission won't do everything the California State Athletic Commission does if they do anything at all. It's been so long. When I was fighting on native land to get around California sanctionings, they did nothing. I mean, literally, we waited on a bathroom scale. There was no blood test. Now, this is, early 2000s, right? But they did nothing. There were no medical checks at all. Every medical check was done by the promotion itself. They would have a doctor there. You literally stood on one foot, touch your nose. Okay, you're good. Get in there. That's how it went. So, maybe things have changed a bit, but they're not going to do what the California State Athletic Commission would have done. Therefore, that gap is all on the UFC. Meaning you decided to go here and not wait for it to be sanctioned in California. Any difference between what California would have done and what the tribal commission does is on you. And so they bear that responsibility as well. So whether or not you think the UFC should be putting on a fight right now, and from what I've seen, it's pretty well split in terms of people who are thrilled this is happening, kind of get back to normal, and people who think it's too soon and it's a terrible risk. Whether or not, whichever side you believe, the UFC is taking a massive risk. They really are putting a lot on their shoulders because they're removing the things that would normally diffuse some responsibility for a show. Usually you have an athletic commission that can take some responsibility. Usually there are other sports leagues doing similar stuff that you can say, hey, well, we're not anymore risking any of these things. In being first, they're taking a massive risk on a lot of different fronts. You understand why. You do get why Dana White and the UFC are doing what they're doing. They have, and I've talked to a couple people in the UFC right now, they haven't laid anybody off. Their money is going out because they're paying their staff. Money is not coming in because they're not holding any events. Of course, minimal money's coming in, but not enough to keep the UFC functioning with their regular staff. So they have money going out. They don't have money coming in. They need to get things going. I was surprised personally that this is a full card, 12 fights. Now, what are they doing there? They're fulfilling their obligations to ESPN. They're providing a prelim that's going to be ESPN and then a pay-per-view. But I thought for their first show, which once again is a huge risk, they would go main card and maybe a couple of other fights as backups or whatever. I didn't think they'd go full prelim and everything. They are. First off, it's to, once again, satisfy their obligations to ESPN. But secondly, fighters usually, if they're big enough, have a clause in their contract that they have to be given fights. They have to be given so many fights in a year or 6 months. And if you don't, it negates their contract. They can leave. So one of the reasons I think we're seeing a full card is to fulfill those contractual obligations, to make sure that these fighters who have, I got to get 3 fights in a year, you're giving them fights. You got to kind of pack these cards. Now, if this works, Dana White has said we're going to go back to back to back and do a bunch of cards at the same time. Not at the same time, but maybe, week after week after week, if they can find a location to do it. On private island or more tribal land or whatever. Once the first one hits and it works, they're going to do them as rapidly as possible in order partly to fulfill these obligations to ESPN and to the fighters themselves. So I was a little surprised because we're not going to know this worked for a good month, at least a couple weeks after the show, because the show itself might go great. Ferguson and Gaethje put on a great fight. It's a back and forth war. The pay-per-view sales are good. Everything's fantastic. 5 or 6 days later, somebody gets ill. That would be a disaster for the UFC. They're really betting a lot that nobody gets ill. Because once someone does, and it can be verifiably traced back to this UFC show, let's say a couple fighters get sick, or 2 guys in a camp get sick, or something where people go, okay, it happened there, then that backs up everything. That stops everything dead in its tracks. All the plans you had for these back-to-back shows, boop, stop, because your liability is just off the chart already. If you keep having shows, multiply that, okay? When you're a company with the valuation of the UFC, you're a huge target. And anybody gets sick, or the family members of somebody get sick, or the family members that do get sick, they're going to go after the UFC. And if someone got ill at the first show, and you knew that, and you made 3 more, you're in big trouble. So what's so interesting about this is we're not going to know the fallout, and the MMA community at large, especially people who support this fight happening, if this fight goes well, it's going to be told you so, everything worked. We're not really going to know for a while. The story afterward is going to be back to normal, everything's great, rah, UFC. If someone gets ill and it takes a few days, a couple weeks, or they're asymptomatic and get their mom sick or their cousin sick or something like that, we might not know that for a while. And so that's an issue I don't think a lot of people are appreciating. A lot of people will be declaring victory if this fight goes off and it's a successful show and the pay-per-views are good. But we're not going to know if the precautions taken to keep people from getting ill worked for quite a while. And so that's why I'm surprised we saw a full card, because you kind of want to minimize that exposure on your first one. Have the main card, that's 10 fighters, 5 fights, let's say 6 or 7, 12 to 14, just to have a little backup, but you're minimizing your risk for the first show. A PR disaster is 12 fighters, 3 of them get ill in a week. That's a huge problem. And the more fighters you have, you're just multiplying the risk factors. You're just multiplying the number of things that can go wrong. Also, that's the number of people that have to travel, maybe half of them. One of the reasons Lemoore, if it happens in Lemoore, it's a good pick, is it's driving distance from Southern California. It's driving distance from Vegas. Now, not all the fighters live there, but it's central enough that a lot of people could drive there. And Lemoore, has medical facilities. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, but it's not that bad. Like, they can get good healthcare if they need it. And it's not a hard hit area. It's not a place. San Joaquin Valley has been hit pretty light. It's just not a big, and if you've never been out there, that's where I spent my first 9 years. It's mostly, I grew up on a fruit ranch. That's a lot of what's out there. It's a lot of farmland. It's just not densely populated. So they don't have the overwhelmed hospitals we're seeing in other parts of the state. So anyway, that's why they're doing what they're doing, but they are taking on a big risk. And I'm sure in the comment section, people have opinions about whether or not it should happen. What you need to recognize is it is a big risk for the UFC. And it's not about whether or not the fight goes well or sells well. It's about whether or not there is a fallout later from this happening. So whether you agree with it or not, the UFC is taking on a big risk. And we as fans and as people involved in the sport, we have to understand the risk that's going on. All right. Appreciate you. And I have a couple projects that are coming out on my YouTube channel. Should be this week. So stay tuned. Let me know what you think of them. And I'll be back ASAP. Later.